Greg, if I can just have you back up on stage for questions. I'm quite reassured to know that robots are taking over the world, but we still need humans. I'm feeling a little bit better in myself because of that. Please send your questions through to Show Gizmo. We've got 15 minutes, and I'm going to try and filter them through. But while I have you both back on stage, robots, big data, humans, sounds like a good collaboration. I'm seeing lots of fear tweets. Seeing lots of people afraid of robots, being like, okay, well, this sounds nice for now, but actually, should we be afraid? If we should be afraid, who's making sure that there's some sort of control within this? And so what about sort of the legislation side of things, especially in New Zealand, because I'm a big advocate for actually New Zealand taking on drones and saying, you know, let's make this a testing ground. We have the space. We don't have lots of sky-rise buildings. But when it comes to legislation, how do you feel about that actually slowing down technology innovation in this space, especially in robotics, or maybe speeding it up with forward-thinking countries?
So there must be at least half a dozen questions buried in there.
Yeah,
I think robotics, big data, those are one big happy family, really. Arguably almost the same thing in the sense that the two technologies are so tightly interwoven. The reason I showed the footage from our UAV and mentioned the fact that that program can't go forward very well in Canada is because I think there is an opportunity, perhaps here, to do research and development on applications based on essentially unmanned flight, autonomous unmanned flight in particular, especially autonomous unmanned flight beyond the line of sight, what an apt term, which is essentially impossible to do in North America right now. And so I think there's a chance to really, have a big impact. For a long time, Amazon.com was coming to Canada to do UAV research because we had a slightly looser legislative environment than existed in the US. And that's probably changed or changing. It is changing. In terms of whether we should worry, I think the world that we live in is changing very quickly. And I think all of the speakers have addressed that. And that's intrinsically unnerving and maybe scary. I don't think it's scary because robots are going to come and, steal our lunch. But because the world is it's going to be, well, some of them don't eat. I think it's going to make the world different, and we'll have to reorganize. And I think we'll have to probably reorganize our socioeconomic fabric a little bit in response to that as well.
Do you think our fear, though, comes from the fact that most people don't interact with robots? Right? We're both robotics people, right? We sit on our labs, we play with robots. Like, I have a day-to-day basis relationship with different types of robots.
I do outdoor robotics. I don't sit in my lab. Yeah.
Okay, I'm an indoor robot girl. But so I have less of a fear, I think, because I understand the potential and the technology, and I have a daily interaction. But I mean, hands up here in the audience if you deal with robots on a day-to-day basis. Less than 5%. So how much do you think the fear is coming from just a lack of interaction with what in my head might be Terminator?
I'm sure that's part of it. And I think the other part is the disruption, right? The disruption is what many people seek, and yet at the same time it's destabilizing. But let me reiterate that theme that I had, that robots, all the people who didn't raise your hand, if you have a cell phone or a new microwave oven or a smart car or Tesla in particular, I mean, if you have many of these technologies, you do interact with the robots every day, and they're going to be everywhere. And you won't even be aware of the fact that you're interacting with a robot.
So we don't have Tesla in New Zealand. We've got 4 cars, sadly. We need Elon to get here. Sean, augmented intelligence. Look, you really show some powerful data here that helps us understand the industry. And I don't know if you agree with me, but it's really nice to visualize data. I think there's so much big data out there sometimes that it's hard to just even know where to look and where to sort of find trends in the data. How much do you think it can increase the value by being able to use augmented intelligence to be able to scan global data? And do you have metrics for like how much of an increase you could get perhaps in positive investment or sort of people who want to try dabbling in this field? Like, what are the numbers for it?
I mean, so I think, that experiment there, if I look at what it would have taken me to run through the entire $9.8 billion of investment into ag tech, as well as trucking through all the GMO discussion over the last 12 months and come up with insights, that would probably take me the best part of, if I was good, 3 months, right? I did that on Sunday, right? So, and I was jet lagged. So I should have prepared earlier, I'm sorry. But I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like I've just compressed 3 months of time down into that space, and I can pass myself off as a reasonable expert in ag tech, right? So it's like, because, jumping down and being able to kind of understand the nuances, the trends, the relationships is really what experts do. But computers can do a lot of that for us. What we then do is start trying to tell stories around that to try and help other people understand what we're seeing, and then start to say, well, how do we want that world to be? And we talk a lot about robots, but like just as clearly in that, the relationship between farmers and consumers could, and indeed looks like it might be one of the bigger drivers in how we actually look at agriculture. So I think it stops us zeroing in on what we might get from the data. Right? And you look at the GMO side of things, right? Like that debate there. Absolutely fascinating how Chipotle tried to position themselves between those two debates, right? Is that space going to evolve, or are other people going to join them, or is that a flash in the pan, right? So these are really important questions as we think about this, because as America goes with GMO, it's going to have a huge impact on what we're doing. And if we're not tracking that or indeed trying to influence it, as a country, our major industry is going to be at the whims of what the American public decides it wants or doesn't want.
Interesting, very interesting. Back to robots. We'll come back to the data. Back to robots, Greg. We're in the ag tech sector, and New Zealand's actually really good at robotics on our farms. Like, we have some amazing technology here. In a disruptive society, as somebody who sees the cutting edge of robotics, have you seen, or what do you think the next sort of robotic or roboticized sort of thing in agri-tech might be? So we have drones that do a lot of land surveys. We can figure out how much fertilizer is working on what, we've got our self-uddering, sorry for those who do it, the robots that do the self-uddering milking. I don't know what the technical term is, but they're awesome. Fine, they scan the udder, be like, oh, Daisy's come in, let's take her milk. So we're at that point where there's a lot of automation happening, but give us the bigger picture. In agri-tech, what do you think is coming? I mean, are we looking at automated robots with visual recognition in agriculture? Are you seeing
that would be my sense. I mean, my sense is that many of the applications of robotics, especially in agri-tech today, are based on automation, but not a lot of really smart decision-making from the systems themselves. Okay. And if we think of many systems being deployed simultaneously, and people who have to monitor and operate those things, I think that connection between a smart system that really goes out and does things fully autonomously, and the people who have to control and operate it, and maybe operate more than one at once, there's a lot of complicated moving parts in there that we'll have to deal with. So the interaction with multiple devices and multiple vehicles that are smart, and the human-robot interaction, the ways that we can make very complicated systems accessible to people who don't necessarily want to spend a year learning how to operate some enormously complicated piece of machinery. Mm-hmm. And so that interface between the people and the machine, that's a huge issue that still remains to be really fully resolved, I think.
But how close do you think we are? So, I mean, I know a lot of people in the farming community who just know their land. And there's that innate sense, that human nature, actually, that is hard to compete with. Do you think we're at that point where software and hardware can come close to that innate sense of, actually, this is what we need to do to the land right now?
I don't think many people are saying we're going to take the person out of the loop, so to speak, and remove them completely from the process. But the idea of augmenting what people can do with machines, that's exactly one of the points that Sean emphasized. Putting the machine and the person together, it seems pretty clear that you can do better than what people can do alone. I mean, if you're on a little tiny plot of land and you're really enjoying doing whatever you're doing, of course, that frisson of having complete control is probably unmatchable. But if you're running a big business or an organization or something at a larger scale, you probably want the participation of machine intelligence, to use a scary word, to assist you in what you're doing, both in physically making the measurements and changing the world, that's the robotic side, and in analyzing the data, which is the AI, cloud side of things. And again, those things I think are really one big domain of problems.
So I like that we've touched GMO again. Thank you for that, Sean. Let's go back to climate change. So you showed in your graph that on the right-hand side, weather was one of the big things. And actually, let's think about the changing climate again and weather. Have you seen prediction models using augmented intelligence that actually can look at weather predictions for the next 10 years to actually think about, from an agricultural point of view, where you shouldn't put things? And are we using that data to actually change where industries are located, or you still think it's in its infancy?
So I think that's actually a lot more of the human stuff. There are models there, but the degree of interaction with a human on that is much, much higher. A couple of things I would say on weather prediction. One is, of course, Climate Corporation was a weather prediction insurance company bought by Monsanto for about $1.2 billion. Weather prediction, actually as a space, is actually seeing some very, very interesting investment going into it. And that's driven largely by a couple of things. One is the ability to kind of run bigger and more complex models. But the second is that more and more we're getting barometers inside of our cell phones. And as the barometers go inside of cell phones, you've now got a distributed network of something that could approach 1 billion barometers scattered around the globe. We've never had that sort of resolution on the ground. Imagine what we can do with the new kinds of computer chips that can start to build weather prediction models on top of that. I'm pretty bullish about those lines in terms of our ability to predict the weather over the increasingly longer terms. The next thing I'd say on that is we're getting effectively full body scans of the Earth every day, updated. What's going to be updated every 15, 20 minutes if we project forward, by fleets and flocks of satellites with algorithms running on top of them to determine exactly how the world is reacting and changing, because climate change is not just about temperature, it's about how the vegetation responds and reacts to that as well. So that's going to come online, and we're going to see that pretty quickly. I think for farmers, one of the interesting things that for me was most exciting looking at the latest R&D in the form of patents was around this idea of combining grazing models with fenceless boundaries, effectively taking autonomous vehicles to herd animals to the optimum grazing point on the farm with a computer controlled system where you don't have to lay fences anymore because you've got effectively autonomous sheepdogs or drones running around the animals for you. So that might make, country calendar on a Sunday a little less interesting, or maybe more interesting, you stick lasers on them. But I think that's going to be really exciting, right? So we've got increased data, better sensors, increased models to do the prediction, autonomous vehicles with grazing data to kind of put these things around. And we should be able to beat the hell out of whatever we're doing, provided we start to use it smartly. So I'm really optimistic about that. I think it's kind of an interesting world. I don't know. I don't think we're going to get overrun by robots. I think it's a little harsh.
Just checking. It's good to ask these questions. So, as a hardware girl, Moore's law, and let's talk about, predictions of the future. And it's really hard in this room of futurists to actually know whether we're talking about 2 years, 5 years, 30 years, where we're at. In your experience, what are the rate of robot increase? Sort of the development stage that you're seeing. Is there a Moore's law equivalent, or where are we looking at for automated robots within major sectors such as primary industries? Do you see us making massive developments in the next 12 months, or are we looking at a 10-year sort of pipeline?
Interestingly, Sean and I had a fairly heated argument last night about this very issue. And our debate was more over, 10 years versus 12 years. It wasn't exactly the big thing, but very fine judgments over where things are going. I think things are moving fast. It's hard to do a Moore's law prediction for robotics because it's not clear what the metric is, what the x-axis is. Is it number of robots, speed of robots? Like CPUs, you can just talk about gigahertz. But it's clear that robotics is having an immense impact, and it's growing very fast. And I think it's probably not going to be exponential because there is hardware in the loop, so it won't maybe go as fast as pure algorithmic computational things, but it's coming quickly, and I think it's probably coming more quickly than most people in the robotics game expected 5 or 10 years ago. So if you look at people doing self-driving cars in universities and different kinds of research labs, I think 5, 10 years ago, people didn't expect to be here today. A few did, but the majority didn't. And so whatever that rate of change is, it's exceeding even optimistic people's expectation, which is extremely different from 10 years ago. I'd make predictions about the future in robotics, and they'd say, you robotics guys, you're always making these crazy predictions. They're the same crazy predictions that never come true. Now they're coming true. And I think it's time to wake up and really grab this opportunity.
So I'm going to finish with a question for both of you, because you're both in the high-tech sector, and we're speaking to an audience of, I don't know whether you're high-tech savvy or not, but I know there's a big fear about actually how do you not get left behind? How do you not become a robotics professor? How do you not become a CTO? But actually, in your current business, be aware of these technologies and also be able to interpret the data, without being a data scientist, and understand which is the best robotics to influence your business. Is there advice, without having to do a whole new degree in something totally different, that you give to people to say, actually, if you want to get into this and bring this in, do this?
I'll make a quick comment. I think the challenge for us, the people developing these technologies, is to make them accessible so you don't have to do a degree in robotics. If that's what it takes, then it's not going to happen. Now, you still have to be on the ball technologically, and so there is stuff to do, and I'll let Sean speak a little bit.
Yeah, look, with the technologies that we've got to kind of effectively scan on a Sunday afternoon the entirety of a conversation on GMOs, or the entirety of venture capital put in, or look into all the patents on livestock management, You can do that in a couple of hours. There's no excuse not to know what's out there, right? The second thing is that things don't just come out of nowhere, right? You don't just suddenly have a self-driving car. There's billions of dollars invested before that becomes a reality. So we're looking at these things here. There's actually quantitative evidence. We look at the drones for agriculture, and it's about $700–800 million. That becomes very interesting commercially at about $2 to $3 billion. So, we're pretty close there. As far as some of the other stuff around weather prediction, the latest new generation models, that's only about $200 million invested. So there's a little more time to go, but that's going to track up and through. So we can make pretty good projections as to where we think that's going to be. And again, the tools are there now to allow us to do that pretty simply, and we can then think about how we want to react to that changing environment. So instead of like, this is coming someday, it becomes a lot more like, this is at 200 million. When it gets to 1.5 billion, then I'm going to be interested.
Interesting. Food for thought. Now, we're about to break for lunch. Before we do, I just want you to know that we made it as like the #1 trending on Twitter, so thank you for being online with your conversations. Please keep tweeting away and doing stuff on Show Gizmo. I'll read them over the lunch break, and I can bring previous conversations into the next conversations that we have in the afternoon. We're back in here at 2 p.m. We're going to have an hour lunch break. Lunch is going to be there, but before we go, please can we thank our speakers, Professor Greg Dudek and Dr. Sean Gawley. Thank you.